That is the defense opening statement in the Go to John case. Again, Go to John on lunch break, but we will be back live in the courtroom when court resumes. Right now, we have the honor of having Judge Brandon Birmingham here out of Dallas, Texas. Judge, thank you so much for joining us. It's so wonderful to have a judge's perspective on some of these trials. We oftentimes talk about what the prosecutor's thinking, what the defense is thinking, but getting a little insight into the tough decision-making that the judge has to go through on some of these evidentiary issues is pretty critical. So I want to dive right in with you. This case is going to hinge, from a defense perspective, on expert testimony. They're claiming a cognitive issue that would make it so the defendant couldn't possibly formulate the intent for first-degree murder. What is the judge going to weigh in determining what experts we're going to hear from in the courtroom?
Well, the judge is always going to consider two things. Number one, is the expert qualified to talk about whatever it is that they're going to talk about? They've got to have the experience, the education, the background, and then other than that, the second part is the judge is going to be considering whether or not the subject matter that they're going to tell or talk about in front of the jury, whether that subject matter is one that's worthy of scientific review and approval and has been accepted in other courts, things like that. So it can't be junk science. It's got to be backed up by credible science, and the person has to be an expert in the field based on either their qualifications, their education, or their experience.
Certainly that's going to be critical here. We know that in the defense opening statement, there was a focus on autism, low IQ, cognitive disabilities. Those will be some of the experts we can expect to hear from. You and I had an interesting conversation during the break, which I sometimes wish these things could be taped. Unfortunately, they're not always captured. But what about the video? There's a jailhouse interview out there. I mean, that is not something we have in these cases, straight from the defendant's mouth. What do you make of that, and how's that going to factor into the case?
Well, there's always the push back and forth. The defense is going to be pushing their theory that in a co-defendant case like this, that the other person that's not on trial is the mastermind. In this case, that would be Gypsy. That the person that is on trial is under the influence of, and we've got some, autism, I think was mentioned before. There's some diminished capacity is going to be their defense. So that's what the defense is going to be playing. Now, the prosecutors are going to be using and looking at any evidence that they have to show premeditation, to show planning, to show also a guilty conscience. And a lot of times the jailhouse phone calls, text messages, or other video interviews like the one that you're talking about will show what the person actually thinks, how their mind actually works. And it's one thing to have scientists come in and say that a person has this particular mental makeup or that particular mental makeup, but really it's going to be how the jurors perceive them actually answering questions and talking about what happened.
That's very true, Judge, and we have some of that other stuff you talked about also, where we expect to see text messages. Certainly that's all going to factor into the case. Stick around with me because there's so much more to talk about. This case has so many twists and turns. Still on lunch break in the Go to John case. Right now we do have to go to a break, but make sure to stick around. More with the judge and more live in the courtroom when we return. We're live in the Baptista trial, and I'm here with Judge Brandon Birmingham. Judge, right now we're hearing from the crime lab. Certainly this evidence needs to get into the record, but there's some interesting facts and twists to this case as well. A lot of this case hinges on who is the initial aggressor. There's two vastly different stories between the victim's girlfriend, who will testify in the case about what she saw, and the story that we hear from the defense in the case. So what does that mean from the jury's perspective and for a potential conviction?
Well, the jurors are always going to want to know what are the stories and whether or not they've been consistent over time. A lot of times in self-defense type cases, which is what this case is, this is not a whodunit. Somebody, Mr. Knight, and Mr. Baptista were engaged in sort of a, what is arguably a mutual combat, depends on, like you're saying, who started it. But, one of the things that's going to be important is the statements that were initially made to the police. And if statements change, that can mean to jurors that, that somebody's hiding something. On the other hand, the thing that they're talking about right now, DNA evidence, I suspect where we might be going with that is to show what are the nature of some of the injuries, and is the version of events that one person gave or another more consistent with the physical evidence. And if one of them is saying, well, he was on top of me, then there better be blood on the other person, to corroborate that. So that's where we're headed. I would imagine that the prosecutors are going to be laying out a case that's going to be consistent with and that the jurors will hopefully believe the girlfriend.
That's a great point, Judge. And yesterday we did hear from the medical examiner and the toxicologist. So the testimony we're hearing right now from the crime lab is going to really fit in and be compared to what we heard yesterday from the medical examiner and the toxicologist. So let's go back to the courtroom. Judge, please stick around. There's so much more to talk about in this case. But right now, Christopher Komar is on the stand. Well, we have a little trouble with our feed right now, but we will be going back live into the Baptista courtroom once we resolve that issue. Right now, we're going to Judge Brandon Birmingham out of Dallas, Texas. Thank you so much for being with us, Judge. Look, there's obviously a lot of contention about this beer bottle. Now, just to get our viewers up to speed and to remind them, the beer bottle seems to be a key piece in this case. The defense says that night the victim approached Baptista and pulled the passenger door open. He had a broken beer bottle in his hand. Now, they seem to be poking a few holes as to the testing. Why wasn't this beer bottle tested? What do you think that means for the defense's case?
Well, it probably means two things. Number one, they are trying to poke holes in any of the investigation. There's always it always behooves the defense to show that more testing could have been done, more information could have been given to the jurors, and because the jurors don't have that information, then perhaps that's reasonable doubt. Also, obviously, this particular beer bottle, I mean, in the case of self-defense, this is just a weapon, whether it's a beer bottle or a knife or a gun or whatever it is, and whoever brandished the weapon first is going to be a source of contention in a self-defense case. So the defense is going to want to make sure that they put the weapon in the other hand, and that perhaps this DNA testing is going to go to show that.
Right, and this beer bottle, pretty key to the extent that you're trying to show that the victim was the aggressor. He's holding this beer bottle, which would essentially, as you said, Judge, be the weapon, would be an item that would put somebody in fear for their own life or grave bodily harm, the standard for self-defense. Something else that I think is very interesting, and I'd really like your input on it, especially in your role as a judge, is the fact that there's another person involved who actually faced trial previously. Now, just to remind our audience, Baptista and Elder, Demetrius Elder, were in a car together. They came from the same party as Knight and his girlfriend. So Demetrius Elder actually stood trial previously. Elder was found not guilty of manslaughter, but guilty of culpable negligence. Now, the judge ruled that Elder's conviction and prior stand your ground hearing would not come before the jury. Now, Judge, can you explain some of that to our audience? Because, why that might be from an evidentiary perspective. Obviously, Baptista stands trial alone, but Elder is certainly a key player in this entire, with respect to all these circumstances. So why not tell the jury that Elder was not convicted of manslaughter?
Well, just because of exactly what you said, every case is different, every person is different, every person's involvement is different. The focus of another trial is, the focus of the other defendant is where all the evidence was presented. That's where all the questions were raised and directed. They were not raised or directed necessarily at what this defendant's actions were in the trial. So really the focuses were different. The jurors heard different things, and the roles of each of them were different. Just because one person was found not guilty or found guilty of a lesser does not necessarily preclude that another person acted differently and could have been found guilty of the higher offense or could have been justified in self-defense either. It just goes to show the very real and ancient proposition that each case is to stand on its own merits. Each person and their actions are to be judged individually.
Certainly, and also weighing that old adage, the probative versus prejudicial, and so many considerations sitting on the bench when determining whether evidence is going to be relevant to a particular case. Right now, we want to go back into this beer bottle, which is such a critical piece of evidence in the case, and a lot of question marks about how the investigation was handled with respect to the testing of the beer bottle. So we're going to go to a crime scene expert who's going to talk to us a little bit more about this. Take a look. All right, we are still waiting to have our feed back in the Baptista courtroom. We're having a bit of a technical difficulty, but we will be back in there shortly. I want to bring back in Judge Brandon Birmingham. Judge, so we were talking a little bit before about the Elder trial. So Elder was in the car with Baptista. Now, he was convicted of culpable negligence, which is a lesser crime. He was facing charges of manslaughter. He was found not guilty. So why don't you tell the viewers a little bit about the impact of having a prior trial? Now, we know that the result of the trial won't be heard by the jury, but what about all that testimony that's out there? There's a lot of overlapping witnesses in the case.
That's right. And so what the lawyers are going to be dealing with is they're going to be dealing with witnesses who are on record saying whatever it is that they saw and heard in the first trial and relaying that. And if something is different, then the lawyers are going to jump onto them. It also gives both sides now have essentially laid out their case, and the defense in this trial is going to have a really good blueprint about how the prosecutors are going to handle this case, what the evidence is going to stand for. The prosecutors are tied down now to a theory. It would be not impossible, but certainly it would beg a lot of consideration if the prosecutor said in one trial the theory of A, B, and C, and then they said in another trial with the same killing theory D, E, and F. So the defense in this case has a really good idea for going second. So that transcript gives them a blueprint, and it also gives them fodder to cross-examine some of the witnesses that testified in the first trial.
And certainly they could be impeached if there's something inconsistent. And as you very astutely pointed out, Judge, something that's so important in these cases is that consistency of the story, especially in a case like this where it's so fact sensitive and you've got such a divergence between the defense theory of the case and the prosecutor's theory of the case. So certainly that's something to watch out for. Another interesting fact, Elder and Baptista were initially both charged with murder. However, those charges were downgraded. A grand jury made that decision in the Elder case, but as you said, Judge, so much linkage between the two cases, a prosecutor made that decision in the Baptista case. So, Judge, stick with us. We do have to go to a break, but we will be back after, hopefully back live into the courtroom, but we'll certainly be breaking it down. Don't move. That was the prosecutor's opening statement in the Godejohn trial. We're going to continue in Godejohn. We hope that the lunch break will end soon and we can go back live to the courtroom. Right now, I'm going to bring Judge Brandon Birmingham back in to talk about the Godejohn case with me. Now, an interesting fact came up, and our senior trial producer, who's live in the courtroom, said the victim doesn't have any family members there. Now, just to review a little bit with our audience, this case had significant national attention. And a lot of that was the result of the motive of Gypsy, the victim's daughter. So Gypsy suffered years of abuse at the hands of her mother, who doctors say suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy. From a young age, she was imprisoned, forced to pretend she had various illnesses, and subjected to medical abuse. Now, presumably, Judge, all of that resulted in her plea deal. Right? So she pled guilty to second-degree murder. She's serving a 10-year sentence. How is that going to factor into Godejohn's case? Because certainly there's clear motive there on Gypsy's part. Now, as far as Godejohn is concerned, is that better for his defense or worse for his defense?
I think it's going to play right into their defense. I mean, after all, what they're saying is that she is the mastermind. She's the convincer. She's the planner. She procured the weapon that ultimately killed her mother. She shaped the mind of Mr. Godejohn to do the killing. So if it's her motive, she's the one who would have given. I mean, it wasn't his motive. He was not the one who was abused. It was her that was abused, and that's her motive. So it's going to play right into it. And it's an interesting thing that happens when you have co-defendants like that. She's going to testify. The prosecutor promised that. Jurors are going to be told about what her plea deal was. And that's an interesting thing because jurors are always going to remember what the sentence was that she was given in determining how to handle this case. It's not going to help him that she's going to testify. We're going to hear about those text messages. We're going to hear about the planning and all of the talking about that. And we're going to hear from himself. But ultimately, though, the jurors are going to be called upon to make a decision about what the appropriate punishment will be. And certainly at that time, because of the way this case is unfolding, she's going to testify. Jurors are going to know what her sentence was, and that might play into what he gets.
Certainly, and a lot of that, presumably, she really has nothing to lose at this point, right? Because she's locked in to her sentence, but certainly cooperating with the prosecutors, knowing that she has a plea deal, will be something the defense will harp on. And we've seen that many, many times where somebody has a plea deal and testifies against a defendant in court, and the thought process is, hey, how credible is this testimony? So we're certainly looking forward to that testimony, which is going to be a key piece in this trial. We do have to go to a break, but we're going to have more with the judge breaking down all of the twists and turns of this Go to John case. And we've also got our eye on the courtroom. We will not miss a minute. Stick with us. We are live in the Baptista case. We still have Christopher Komar on the stand. He's from the Sheriff's Crime Lab. Now, Judge, what they're talking about here is basically the integrity of the crime scene, it seems. They're talking about whether or not there's the possibility that DNA might have been transferred as opposed to being found on an actual item from the crime scene. Can you tell us a little bit about that? You're a former prosecutor. You're a judge now. As far as these crime scene specialists, why is this important? Why is all this DNA evidence important to the case?
What you do as a prosecutor with the crime scene specialist is you know what you're going to get. You know what your witnesses are going to say, and you're going to try to match up what they say with the physical evidence. So you can go about this one of two ways. You can either put the crime scene person on first in anticipation of what your witness will say, or you put your witness on and then your crime scene person will corroborate it. Here's how they do that. If a witness says, well, the killing happened over here and the person was over here in this area and they picked up this weapon and they tried to use it, well, once those items are collected or the scene is swabbed and perhaps there's blood there, those clues, that DNA evidence is going to either corroborate or not corroborate what that witness is saying. So they're setting up what their witnesses are going to say here in a little bit to make them more believable.
Right, and certainly that matters a lot when you have such divergent versions of the facts between the prosecutor's version and the defense version of the facts, and the question becomes, what is that scientific evidence going to support? We're going to go back live into the courtroom, more with this witness on the crime scene. We're continuing to hear about the crime scene and the results of the testing in the Baptista case. Judge Brandon Birmingham has been here with me really breaking this down. Judge, one thing we haven't touched upon, and it's not really relating to the testimony we're hearing right now, but it's something that our viewers are very interested in this case. What's the impact of the intoxication level of the victim? So just your review with our viewers. Knight, the victim in the case, had alcohol, marijuana, flakka, which is similar to bath salts, and cocaine in his system. Now, how does that matter? Because obviously, if the victim's intoxicated, isn't there an argument to be made that he was acting erratically and potentially putting the defendant in fear for his life?
Of every self-defense case ultimately is whether the conduct at the time was reasonable given all the circumstances. We all know just by our own common sense that people act differently if they're drunk and high, and depending on what they're drunk or high on, you know, people fight more when they're drinking. People tend to act very very aggressively when they're on these bath salts. We've seen that before. Jurors know that. So that's going to play right into the hands of somebody saying, I had to defend myself because this guy was, acting out of his mind. In other words, my conduct was reasonable, not just against somebody who was advancing towards me, but somebody who was advancing towards me with all of those things in their system. They're not acting rationally. I'm the one who's acting rationally. So that's a very, very important piece of the puzzle for the defense in this case.
Right, and certainly, especially with, and you mentioned it before, bath salts. We remember some of those cases that we saw where it seemed like people were almost superhuman strength, and some of that is what the defense has already said, that despite stabbing, despite the fighting, that the victim, Knight, actually didn't really seem to be affected. So it's certainly going to be interesting to hear as more experts come on the stand what impact that might have. Judge, thank you so much for joining us today. Your insights have been invaluable, and I hope you'll come back and discuss these cases with us again.
I love doing this stuff. Thank you so very much for having me. We'll see you very soon.
Absolutely. Judge Brandon Birmingham, everybody. Such a great guy and such a great perspective. All right, now we're going to move to a commercial break. As soon as the break is over, we're hopefully going back live into the Baptista courtroom, and we obviously have our eye on Go to John. We'll make sure that you don't miss a thing. Stick with us.